remarks, I'm going to give the floor now to my colleague Alejandro Hernandez to say a couple of words, and then we're going to have Agnes. Alejandro, please, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Luis. Dear all, it's a great pleasure to welcome you today alongside such an excellent group of speakers as we open this important event on the future of electricity distribution. Today, RAP is very pleased to present our new report, Transitioning to Distribution System Operators in Brazil, Functions, Benefit, and Strategic Pathways. I'm particularly optimistic about the direction we are heading. The opportunity before us is clear. We can transform many existing passive assets and flexible consumer loads into valuable resources. Assets that don't just sit idle, but instead help us lower the cost of running cleaner and more reliable power systems. But we must acknowledge that there is a real challenge, and this is inertia. It is always easier to keep on doing things the way we have done them in the past. The systems, the rules, the habits, they tend to resist change. And yet, if we allow inertia to guide us, we risk missing out on the full potential of the technologies already at our fingerprints. That is why defining possible pathways of reform is so important. The distribution sector in particular is where I believe we will see many of the most tangible benefits. For instance, in the UK, the system operator is currently running a project that aims to develop the ability to restart the power system after a blackout using only distributed energy resources. And it is a very powerful signal of what is possible. This is why today's discussion is so timely and so relevant. We're not just talking about infrastructure, we are talking about rethinking how we plan and how we operate the distribution grid itself, so we can unlock the value that distributed resources can bring to the entire system. I look forward to the insights and the dialogue that will help us move in that direction. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Alejandro. Agnes, please, you have the floor now. Thank you, Luis. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here this morning. ANEEL has signed an MOU with RAP to deal with very important topic for regulators. We will count on international expertise, on their international expertise for this energy transition environment with new opportunities that will be brought by digitization processes. One of the major challenges that we are facing at ANEEL is certainly the new role played by distribution. We have gone through a major process since last year. We have debated new concession agreements for distributors. Some distributors have been privatized in the late 90s, and these contracts are now coming to an end, or will come to an end in future years. The Ministry of Mines and Energy, or MME, has a set of guidelines for these concession contracts. ANEEL underwent a broad debate process with society, and we have new contracts with rights and obligations. There is now a more relevant role to be played by distributors as operators of distribution systems. To write these clauses, we were in contact with the ONS, the National Operator System, ONS in Brazil. We have to harmonize procedures. We have to align the ONS for transmission with distributors, of course. So we have been working on that for some time now to reach consistency. As Alejandro well mentioned in his opening remarks, we are going through a moment that allows us to benefit from many distributor energy resources. But this is a challenge, of course, for system operations. In Brazil and in ANEEL, we face the same challenges. We have a lot of work to do in order to quantify and qualify the costs and benefits played by micro and mini distributed generation. When we think of DSO's role, we have to think of mini and micro distribution. They play a role, and they might contribute to more efficient operations. So adding energy or power to the grid when it's necessary. And this should all be done in tandem with the needs of consumers and operators, or distributors rather, to better manage all these assets. So I don't want to speak too much. I want to move to the debate. Alejandro, I'm very happy to see you here. We've not seen for a while. We signed the MOU in January, and it's already bearing fruit. This article about transition is one of these results. And being here in this virtual panel is really a pleasure to be here with experts from the ministry, from PSR, ONS, RAP, and Abradi, of course, and all these respected experts. You are the minds who will help us think of solutions. So once again, thank you all for your support and your interest in contributing to Brazil in such an important debate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Agnes, for your words. We hope that, ANEEL's and RAP's partnership has been very fruitful recently, and we hope to continue like that in coming years. Since we are running 5 minutes behind schedule, I actually forgot to thank all panelists for giving your time to be here. ANEEL was very helpful in elaborating this webinar and the article. I also want to thank Bianca, Lucas, Leonardo, and Daniela, who will be part of the panel. Thank you for being here for this webinar. Okay, without further ado, let me move to the presentation of the article itself. I'll be sharing this part of the presentation with our colleague Raj Addepalli, who's also a part of this process of writing the article. He will be speaking English, I'll be speaking Portuguese, but Raj will start.
Luiz, please share. Yes. Okay, as you're beginning, thank you very much to all the participants here. Appreciate it. Given that there are a multitude of folks here, the terminology that we all use could be different in different countries, so bear with me for that. So when we talk about transitioning to DSO, the question comes up, why now? What's the impetus now to think differently? As Alejandro mentioned at the beginning, in my view, there are different confluencing factors that are driving this change. One, we are seeing a whole lot of new resources that didn't exist maybe 20 years back as in this kind of volume. Whether you think of rooftop solars, various kinds of storage, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on and so forth, other distributed generation resources. The second factor that's driving is technology, whether it's communications, control systems, or internet, the speed with which you can do transactions and communicate. And the third, there is a significant more interest in climate change and concerns about climate change and things that we can do to address it, power sector being one of the contributors to the concern. And fourth, resulting from that is an enormous amount of capital that's flowing into this sector that could help make the changes that we need. And finally, but the most important, without which we won't have any of this stuff, is the interest from consumers themselves. which is a driving factor. So to me, all these put together provides a perfect opportunity for us to think differently, to improve the efficiency of the sector, to improve or reduce the emissions or environmental harms in the sector, and to satisfy consumer needs in a much better fashion at lower cost, hopefully, and with increased reliability. So with that as the driver, Luiz, can you go to the next slide? To me, this whole exercise, I'd like to think of this as a marathon, a long-term issue. This is not a sprint. There are no magic solutions that will change everything overnight. So we should continue to think about how do we address this over time in a systematic, methodical fashion, taking into consideration all the constraints that we face and other factors that may be limiting. So with that said, what is this paper about that RAP has pulled together? As Luiz said, I'll start with some of the fundamental issues associated with this DSO, and then Luiz will carry this forward with very specific suggestions, recommendations, or if you want to call a roadmap for how these can be thought about in the context of Brazilian power sector. So we'll cover what's a DSO model, core functions. For some of you, all this may not be new, so bear with me for that. And what's a value proposition and what are the benefits? And how does this fit into where Brazil is moving, where it is now and where it is moving to? And a potential implementation strategy that has different phases, and then several recommendations to consider for the regulators and other key players in the sector. Next slide, please. So as Ms. Agnes talked about the changes that are happening in the sector, in the distribution, especially there, and throughout the world for that matter. So when we think of what do they do and how can we see a potential change, and the distributed energy resources that Alejandro mentioned, again, distributed energy resources is a broad umbrella term to include all resources such as rooftop solars, other distributed generation, storage, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on and so forth. That could be inside a customer premise or outside a customer premise, but within the distribution space footprint. That could help meet the needs of system needs. So who plans, who invests in, and who owns and maintains the distribution system is a key variable for consideration. Today, the incumbent distribution utilities do all these functions, and they've done that for decades, not just in Brazil, but all over the world. The distribution utilities plan for the system next year, next 5 years, 10 years, and so on, and they invest in the system to meet the reliability needs of consumers, and they earn a return on their investments, and they maintain and receive the O&M operating and maintenance costs and so on. And the regulators play a big role given the monopoly status of these entities. And they operate the system. And now with this new set of resources, distributed energy resources, the next question is who should own them and maintain them and invest in them? And how do we think of markets? So one way to think about in the broad term, again, it's not a full, complete analogy, but many of us are familiar with existing wholesale markets. We have different models around the world, but in many places, there is unbundling of the sector from generation, from transmission, from distribution assets. And in the wholesale market, we have an operator who operates the system, but they may not, and in fact, in most places, they don't own generation. But they have control sometimes of the transmission assets in terms of operations. and transmission is owned by a separate entity, generation is owned by a separate entity. The system operator typically is independent, but dispatches units, commits and dispatches based on system needs. So if you think in that sense, on a distribution side, who should own this operator? Should the operator own any of the assets? And if not, who should own them and maintain them? And distributed energy resources, the same question, who should own and maintain them and invest in them? And then in many places, we also have power markets. In some places, they're embedded within the system operators. Some places, they have separate power exchanges. But again, those are independent elements, and that help to determine pricing structures in competitive markets. Supply and demand as the driving force. So to come up with price, the markets enable the buyers and sellers with transactions. Is that a complete analogy? Perhaps not, and perhaps not in the near term for the DSO. Perhaps the existing distribution utility incumbent will continue to be performing a lot of these functions going forward for a number of years to come. But I don't want to get caught up with who should own and who should maintain for now, but rather what kind of functions are incremental to what we do now, what the distribution utilities do now, and how should they be carried out. And so next slide, please. There we can think of, so this is a functional perspective. So what are the additional functionalities built into the DSO concept and how to advance them in the near to medium term rather than on long-term DSO structures? Some of you probably saw this picture from other resources. You have the transmission grid at the top and the local utility, distribution utility in the middle, and then all these distributed resources in the grid at the bottom. Next slide, please. So here we are focused on, in my view, three big elements. One is the planning aspect, and the second is the operations, and the third is the markets. What happens today, and what do we see as the future, and how do we get there in each of these to move forward to quote a DSO type model. So, this paper is focused on each one of these elements. How do we move forward? And the role of the regulator in enabling this transition, and the role of other players in making this happen. Next slide, please. So we'll focus on these functions. So starting with the system planning. So as we all know today, we have significant penetration of distributed energy resources coming in, some voluntarily, some due to government policies. So how do we take advantage, as Alejandro said at the beginning, rather than how do we make sure they're used the most efficient way, and how do we facilitate their participation, first their development and then their participation in the distribution system. And also many of them may also help contribute in the bulk power system as well. As we all know now, with the rooftop solar and other resources, power is flowing back into the distribution utilities. And in some places, it's causing reliability problems for some without adequate planning. So planning for these new resources, how to enable them, how to facilitate them, and where they should be located within the system, what's the best place for them to be located, and how should they be used by the operator. Most of these distributed energy resources are not visible to the bulk power operator. These are small resources, whereas the distribution utility has a much better handle on the volume and the characteristics of these DERs. Again, many system operators will attest that if we allow the DERs to just come on without adequate planning, the distribution operator can be overwhelmed in certain neighborhoods, and there have been documented concerns about their impact on the system reliability. So planning for and in lieu of, in consideration of these DERs is a new challenge the utilities have to adapt to. Again, this may not be rocket science, but it requires deliberate planning and consideration. Next slide, please. And the evolution of planning. So what do these DERs, as Ms. Agnes mentioned, they can not only provide energy and balancing services to the distribution utilities, and they can also be considered a capacity resource. Not only for the distribution utility, but also at times to the bulk power system operator. So how do we forecast the forecasting exercise? What changes are needed to current practices of forecasting loads and in light of the distribution utilities, especially with rooftop solar, and what type of DERs provide the most value to the system, and what type of system upgrades are needed for the distribution system. The old capital budgeting process for the next year, next 5 years, how should that be revised or modified in light of DERs? Can we reduce or avoid the need for a certain amount of distribution investments to begin with in light of the DERs? Can we avoid other kind of O&M in light of the DERs? And how do we coordinate the interconnection protocols for these resources and the interaction between the TSO, the transmission, and the bulk power operator and the distribution utility? So, and making them transparent, the whole planning process is going to be extremely relevant. For the most part, in many places, the distribution utility planning is pretty much closed, a black box to external market participants. The regulators may know more about it, but other entities don't have visibility into how the distribution utility does planning. So allowing for more transparency and more dialogue would facilitate the DER, distributed energy resource participants, to understand where the utility system is, where they have incremental hosting capacity to accommodate DERs, where they're planning their investments, and what's the best opportunity for DERs to participate locationally and time-wise, geographically, electrically, locationally, and time-wise. What's the best place in the system for the DERs to contribute and add value at the lowest cost? Where can they minimize interconnection costs, and so on. So making it more proactive, interactive, and transparent to the market participants would help the DER. So this would require some changes in the current planning processes of distribution utilities, how they do it. And the regulators can play a big part in facilitating this openness. And for example, in some parts of the US now, they have very open dialogue on the next 5-year plans, distribution system implementation plans, and where the books are open more transparently than before, so everybody can see what is happening and can contribute in this process. Next slide, please. Then the second component, the major one, is system operations. Again, with the increasing intermittent resources, the life is a little bit more difficult for the operators, both at the bulk power level and even the distribution level. So how do we increase the operations? What kind of additional controls do the operators need? What kind of signals do they need to get from the DER providers or to send them in order to maximize their value to the system? Next slide, please. Again, what changes are needed to the existing system operations? Some of you probably have heard of DERMS, and some of the utilities use it actively. Some are in the process of developing the distributed energy resource management systems. Again, new ways of looking at system operations to accommodate, facilitate distributed energy resources. Next slide, please. Another thing that some utilities are looking at is, instead of doing conventional interconnection processes, can we think of what's called flexible interconnection, whereby we can effectively increase the hosting capacity of the DER resources. Instead of limiting how much DER can be connected to a given system without any augmentation of the distribution system, by using this flexible concept, given that it's time varying resource and the load is time varying as well, the resource output is time varying, can we somehow come up with a better way for the given distribution asset? Can we increase the accommodation of DER output into the system? Again, these are new ways to think about how to improve existing operational flexibility and maximize the value of DERs. Next slide, please. In many of these, the report goes into more detail than what I'm talking here. And then finally, the third component, planning, operations, and then markets. This may be the most complex one to develop. It may take a long time to come up with. We are pretty used to bulk power system compared to wholesale markets, pretty active, vibrant, deep, liquid in many places, the energy markets, and even the ancillary and in some places capacity. But it's not clear that you can replicate that anytime soon here. Initially, it may be procurement of maybe the distribution utility owning and installing certain DERs, or procuring them in a competitive fashion through bilateral contracts, RFP processes, and eventually, as the DER assets proliferate with different characteristics and different value propositions and consumer interests change, and as we develop additional mechanisms, perhaps there could be a different set of market-based mechanisms for procurement and development of DERs. And some of them may require additional financial support than what the markets can provide. So this is going to be an evolving, probably the slowest in my view, among the three aspects: planning, operations, and markets. Next slide, please. So again, why do we need this DO? Optimizing assets, differing costly infrastructure upgrades by leveraging what some people call non-wires alternatives, like demand flexibility, which includes demand response, energy efficiencies, and storage, and RTS and other assets. I'll just give you one quick example. One of the utilities in the US identified a need for, let's say, 50 megawatts of load growth in the next 5 years in a particular neighborhood. The traditional utility solution is let's develop some additional, maybe a substation, transformers, poles, wires, the standard infrastructure. Instead, they were challenged to come up with a way of utilizing distributed energy resources. They issued a solicitation, RFP, request for proposals, and lo and behold, they got an immense amount of response, and the utility was able to meet the needs, at least for the next number of years, using a set of these DER as a portfolio and defer the need for investing in the wires solutions. So that's the non-wires alternatives. So there are other practical examples of the utilization of NWAs as a means to meet the resource needs at a lower cost and most likely in a cleaner fashion than the traditional solutions. Do NWAs work at all the places and all the time? Perhaps not, but there should be a conscious evaluation by the distribution utilities supported by regulatory policies to explore NWAs that could be more beneficial to consumer interests in terms of lower costs and higher reliability and lower emissions as the DERs proliferate. And how do we integrate the DERs in terms of hosting capacity? What aspects would facilitate identifying the locations where DERs can be added without a huge amount of distribution utility upgrades, that those which would have costs. And virtual power plants and others are coming up, and DER aggregators. Again, given these small resources, there are in many places aggregators that will aggregate these DER resources. 5 kW, 20 kW, whatever, and come up with, let's say, half a megawatt or a megawatt of resource they could offer to the distribution utility, and in some places to the wholesale operator as a resource to meet the system needs. So how do we enable these DER aggregators that could, again, it's a value proposition. The more you can use DERs, perhaps you can rely less on peaking plants that may be more expensive or have more emissions. Next slide, please. So again, improved basket of services that DSOs can provide, and with the DER integration, the DSO hopefully can do a good job of facilitating growing the DERs, again, to benefit the system and benefit consumers. Next slide, please. Optimization we talked about. Next slide, please. So what is the role of the regulators? I think, to me, that's a big variable parameter to consider in many of the countries. What can regulators do? Some of this may be organic, but some of them would require active policy intervention by the regulators, have a critical role, because many of the distribution utilities, rightly so, are concerned about a lot of issues, and those need to be addressed in earnest. Would we lose revenues if more DERs come into the system? Lost revenues could be an issue, or we may lose customers who are more profitable customers. Do the utilities have an incentive to put in NWAs, especially if that reduces their asset base on which they earn a return? So whereas if they just contract with the DERs, it may be an operating expense rather than a capital asset. So utilities may have a concern with that. And in many places, utilities are concerned about potential job losses. Hey, would these take away jobs, the DERs and the proliferation of them? So all these concerns are real and need to be addressed by the regulators to provide adequate comfort to the distribution utilities to move forward earnestly in this journey. And also, there's a lot of concern about would these DERs actually work? Do they actually meet system reliability? Can we count on them, and how can we count on them? And how much can we count on them? Sandboxes or demonstration projects would help go a long way. Again, this won't be 1 year or 2 years, it could be multiple years to get the comfort level and the understanding of how they work and how they can be integrated into the system. And finally, a cost-benefit framework. Again, we don't want to raise consumer rates for simply because we want to promote DERs. We need a framework. How do we analyze the benefits of these systems and the costs associated with them? And we should be pursuing cost-effective solutions that are in the interest of the customers. Next slide, please. So developing the DER, again, they won't happen just overnight. Again, some may happen organically, but a policy intervention. How do we promote DERs? Those providers who provide these resources, they need certainty. Anybody will tell you for investment, they need certainty, predictability, and confidence in the marketplace. So the regulators need to provide that. How do we license these DER providers? So to make sure we're not dealing with fly-by-night operators, we need to make sure the DER providers are comfortable, consumers are comfortable, utilities are comfortable with these players. And aggregation requires rules. How do we aggregate? What's the minimum size? And how do we measure? And so on. So all those are market rules. Access to customer data is extremely important for DER providers to aggregate loads or resources. Next slide, please. Consumer education, without which nothing can be done. Consumers need to be comfortable with participating in these programs. Dynamic price signals, whether it's time of day, hourly prices, or more sophisticated pricing, is essential to exploit the full value of the DERs. And customer incentives also go a long way. Next slide, please. And I'll turn to Luiz from here on to carry the dialogue here.
Thanks, Raj. Well, this was quite a comprehensive overview of how we're handling DSOs, looking at this functional approach, looking at operations, planning, and markets. And we are, well, also looking closely at the Brazilian framework. We have a very interesting window of opportunity here. We're engaging with stakeholders, different stakeholders in Brazil, and at the same time, we're looking at a complex challenge in the Brazilian context. We're going to walk you through these articles very briefly, sharing more information about these details. We're looking at revenue decoupling for one, looking at how we're going to break down the revenues between wire and energy, and seeking to unlock business models and market rules. Through the rapid growth of DER in Brazil, mainly with solar distributed energy, we have seen a disruption to the traditional distribution model. Some distributors have felt the impact harder than others and have been feeling different and new needs to adapt their operations and to adapt their operating and control systems. This has been happening for some time now, and to us, well, it is a problem that we need to address and that Brazil is addressing. It's also at the same time an opportunity to see DSO as one more tool that will take us forward. And there are two more points here that are market distortions. In our view, it will have an impact on future markets. And first, we have the subsidy burden, the high level of subsidies we have in Brazil. This is an important market distortion, and that can be an important risk. We need to keep track of how it will evolve going forward. And non-technical losses, how are we going to handle this point going forward? And so these are distortions that we have in the Brazilian market. And considering all that Raj has already shared, we are proposing, and this is a proposition, in fact, on our side, and it is open to, of course, reviews, and we are proposing a transition strategy to a DSO model in Brazil, which requires a carefully structured implementation strategy. We see here the deadlines, a roadmap, so to speak, the initial planning, market evolution. And Rash also implemented this in New York. We also looked at what was deployed in the UK, in Australia. And now we are considering 4 different phases to organize this DSO model implementation in Brazil as a set of tools that we can resort to in Brazil that can handle and tackle critical issues in the energy sector. The different activities have already been carried out by the different agents in the energy industry in Brazil. So the first step here is to get a better understanding of how these activities will be carried out: technical, operation, operating strategies, zoning, all of these areas. Well, we have to be very clear on how these areas will be implemented and will operate in Brazil. And the article also states that Brazil is not one single model. We have different market scenarios in Brazil when it comes to distribution that we also need to understand. So this would be the starting point for this 2-year plan. We need to have clarity on this starting point, on the regulatory framework, how it would actually accommodate these different features and how and when. And moving to the second phase, we would actually have pilots on what is already happening. We know there are distributors that are already working on their pilots in the initial market implementation. We have successful tariff models that we can look at to learn what is happening when it comes to setting new rules and also educating the market and market players through the pilots and sandbox. And this would be the initial phase. After that, we would get into the third phase, provided, well, markets that are more mature and ready, we would test how we would scale this model at a faster pace, looking at where we need to implement these new rules, where the infrastructure is ready for that, and mature, so where we could expand with intelligent meters faster. This would be the overview we would have through this initial planning and assessment, and different pilot projects would be running simultaneously. And after this period, we would take a closer look at the roadmap going forward, looking at these different context scenarios after we have set the clear rules, regulatory framework for this market. And I will go through this very briefly now because Rash has already covered this. We have fundamental key aspects here: engagement and consumer engagement and protection. They need to be clear on the benefits and opportunities for them, the tariff structures, how it would impact them, their responsibilities, their duties. We need to be very clear on how we're going to protect our consumers with tariff structures that are transparent. We have to focus on data privacy. Also, they need to be reliable. We need to have trust and transition mechanisms to align the agenda of the current electricity sector, whether we're talking about concessions or opening the market. We need to be very clear on these aspects too. And as Raj mentioned, oftentimes, of course, the new planning logic system.
It's important to understand that Brazil is a country with different market realities for operations and distribution. That's why we are suggesting an initial framework on how to assess if distributors and markets are ready for the DSO market. So we have through the three functions, again, planning, operations, and market. And we have thought of a technical infrastructure, operational capabilities, and market development. These are the dimensions that allow us to rate, according to different criteria, the readiness. So we start with an initial stage, and then we can move forward. If we look, for instance, at infrastructure requirements, well, we have SCADA, manual operations, legacy metering, DERMS, which is a more advanced version. Then we also look at data management, integration of AI tools, what are the pricing mechanisms and services and products offered in the market. With these different criteria and dimensions, we believe it is possible to analyze the readiness levels of distributors in the Brazilian distribution market. This will allow us to understand where we should start, where maybe we should hold for a little bit longer, depending on the readiness of these markets for a DSO model in Brazil. In our article, this is explained in further detail. I'm being quick here because we don't have a lot of time today. That leads us to some recommendations. We believe some of them are more immediate recommendations, what we call no regret actions, right? These could be implemented in a timely manner, but Brazil is already moving in that direction. demand flexibility programs. We believe they are really interesting. This could not hinder us in the long term. It's a very interesting mechanism, and it can be developed right now. Testing new models using the sandbox system, this is key, and Brazil has experience in doing that. We think it's important to adopt more granular metrics at the substation level and at the feeder level to better understand the operations strategy, to define market areas and planning. Ideally, the ownership of RED's assets should be neutral without centering this ownership in distributors. And we also believe it's important to develop a value to the system payment approach. This is already in the Brazilian agenda. We need to understand, of course, payment mechanisms and what value they would provide to the system according to reliability, resilience, and all these categories we already know. Finally, we believe that these recommendations have to be aligned to the Brazilian agenda looking at the long term. So we have short-term actions, but they must be developed focusing on the future we want to have. We have the revenue decoupling mechanism. This is key. It's important to modernize the system planning. We need new planning models, maybe creating a work group with this different frameworks for different realities in Brazil. Modernizing infrastructure and reaching digitization is key, of course. Opening the market to competition. This will develop new services and products, and it can be helpful, of course. The Brazilian regulatory agenda is already focusing on creating a clear roadmap for tariff modernization, and this is important. We have several sandboxes for that. And we have some interesting ideas that are aligned to what we're suggesting. And it's also important to develop a Brazilian pathway for the DSO agenda, looking at the role of distributors in the future. It's important to understand how all these parts and tools can be used to provide more benefit to the Brazilian energy industry. As a final remark, the idea of this paper is a call to action. It's to foster debate. We want to leverage the work that is already being conducted in Brazil. Brazil is doing hard work, whether that's the ministry, regulatory agencies, and the players in the system. So we firmly believe this can leverage this work to solve Brazilian problems. We also believe this can accelerate the modernization of the Brazilian system, mostly in distribution. And we also wish to engage and empower. We want to create more debate and discussion in different fora. So that's it from my end. I hope you've enjoyed. I forgot to say in the beginning that there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Feel free to start typing in your questions. We will collect everyone's questions. And now I'd like to give the floor to Leonardo Queiroz and so that we can continue with our webinar. We will now have a panel discussion, and this paper presentation is just a backdrop to foster our debate. So now we're going to move to the discussion panel with those who are in Brazil and who conduct the Brazilian energy industry. Leonardo, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you, Luiz. Good morning, everyone. Okay, so we will now start our expert panel. Just like Agnes said, I would like to congratulate RAP for the organization of this event. Alejandro, Raj, Luiz, thank you. We are really placing our bets in this partnership with you. We know this is a challenging scenario, but counting on partners like you and others we can rest our beds at night knowing that we will be able to face the challenge. I'd like to salute all the panel members, and I will start by giving the floor to Bianca Alencar. She's here representing the Ministry of Mines and Energy, or MME, in the Brazilian acronym. Good morning, Bianca. I have an initial question just to kick off our debate after looking at the presentation. There's a study by RAP also about this. Can you give us an initial perspective from the ministry? You design at the ministry designs public policies for this industry. So what is your perspective as the ministry for the energy industry in Brazil? Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Leonardo, and I'd like to thank everyone for the invitation. I'd like to salute the colleagues that are very relevant for our industry. So I'm going to be brief in my presentation. I have no slides. Our perspective at the ministry for this context is the following. The DSO model represents an evolution looking at the deep changes that are taking place in the industry. As we saw in the presentation and in the report, distributed generation has moved forward. We want to electrify the demand. We have considerable growth of distributed energy resources. And consumers are playing a more active role. They're demanding more transparency, quality, and innovation. We believe this transformation requires an approach focused on distribution to transform distribution as we know it today. It cannot be just providing energy in a unilateral manner. It should play a more active role, and this will, of course, contribute to the offering of other systemic services, and that will reduce costs for consumers and provide more flexibility. I wanted to mention the provisional measure that has been published recently, Provisional Measure 1300. It is key to bring more sustainability to the Brazilian energy system. We acknowledge that the current model has accumulated some distortions through time, and we understand we need to rebalance the system so that it remains economically feasible, fair, and sustainable. Sustainability is not just about resources or expanding the offering, but we need the right economic signals, transparency, efficiency, and foreseeability. So this provisional measure is focused on social justice and tariff justice. Then we have a pillar concerning consumer freedom, so opening the market, which will be an important discussion, and it's in the provisional measure, and also sector balance, which is in contact with ending distortions of subsidies, as was mentioned. We want right pricing and structured long-term planning for this industry. The provisional measure, or MP in the Portuguese acronym, approaches other aspects. We modernize the legal framework. There is an important point which changes a legislation showing the need to separate prices from the actual regulated activity of providing energy from the distribution service. And this is included in the MP, in the provisional measure. ANEEL is looking at moving that forward, but if we have that in the legislation, it will be easier to move forward. And we saw that suggestion in the report that was just presented. It's important to separate these two things in order to structure DSOs. The provisional measure also looks at the possibility of having more flexibility in hiring criteria or contract criteria. So the need to hire the full load will not be mandatory anymore, and this will provide more flexibility to the market. We already have resources that still look from a centralized perspective. The idea is to face, of course, consumer needs. The provisional measure talks about modernizing prices. There are different possibilities, and ANEEL, of course, is already working on that. We have the regulatory sandboxes, and we want to bring this into the legal framework to make the system more sound and to help it move forward and become more modern. Moving beyond the provisional measure, Agnes mentioned the decree that will renew these concessions. There was a lot of debate to bring a new perspective. We hope distributors modernize their work. Distributors should look at an expansion, and we have a new term in the contract. Distributors, among other things, they should assess the possibility of integrating to other systems or to DER. So this is a new perspective that is reflected in the ongoing initiatives of the Brazilian energy industry. There is another initiative, which is a recent one, just recently published. It's an ordinance 111. It already brings guidelines to gradually digitize the grid, the distribution grid. We have the decree, of course, to renovate the concessions, but the ordinance is aligned to innovation, transparency, and efficiency principles. This ordinance has a guideline about consumer data so that consumers can better understand their consumption patterns. This will be reflected, of course, in the use of the grid, the possibility of providing new services and products, grid safety, and integrating digital networks. I hope I was able to show that the ministry wants to foster a better regulatory environment that will foster the transition we're looking for. We want to contribute with guidelines, and we want to create the right incentives to align different institutions, always putting consumers at the center as well of our policies. Thank you very much, Leonardo. That's what I had initially. Thank you, Bianca. I was just making some notes on the interesting points you mentioned. I know you don't have a lot of time, but we've seen the ministry very active in recent months on the topic at hand. I'm now going to give the floor to Lucas Malheiros from ABRADE, the Brazilian Association of Power Distributors. ABRADE is the acronym. Good morning, Mr. Malheiros. Can you give us ABRADE's perspective on that topic? How do you see the evolution of the role of distributors in planning the grid? And how do you see the DSO system? Good morning. Thank you for your question. I would like to thank RAP first for reviewing this material and now to participate in this panel. As a starting point, we should acknowledge that a transition is necessary. Alejandro said in his opening remarks, Alejandro mentioned inertia or the risk of doing things the way we used to do. Now, we must understand that the transition is necessary. If we don't, our country can procrastinate things that are fundamental to leave the current DNO model or the traditional distribution and evolve into a model that is closer to DSO. Of course, DSO is a broad concept, and we can have different ideas in our minds about what a DSO is. But it's important to remember the transition is necessary. Distributors keep on being a fundamental part of this chain to reach targets connected to electrification and decarbonization of the economy. We think that our energy mix is green. Yes, it is. Over 90%. The ONS can bring us more data, but over 90% of our energy mix is renewable. However, when we think of Brazil's energy mix, we still have room for improvement in decarbonization. And we can also further electrify the economy. We have industries such as the chemical industry or transportation or different manufacturing industries. If they electrify their systems, that will bring positive targets and results for Brazil in the decarbonization agenda. So having sounder grids, this is key. We must bear in mind that the central role of distributors is to keep the lights on. It's to ensure reliability, resilience at all times, so that we have reliable energy supply in our country. That is why distributors have planned investing 48 billion in 2025. For the next 5 years, when we look at the plan by ANEEL, we have 235 billion planned in investments in improvement, expansion, and grid renewal. This is very much aligned to ensuring energy safety for the present, but also looking at the future and for the necessary evolution.
And by evolution, we mean we need to evolve the business models we have in Brazil, adapt them to the new needs, technical and operational challenges, the bidirectional and multidirectional flows that is needed now in the energy industry, and users have to be at the forefront. They have to be the key players in this process, and I will actually dive deeper into this later on, but now looking at the challenges we'll be facing to evolve to the DSO model, distributors today were not put out to operate under a DSO model. We don't have the institutional and regulatory framework in place. We didn't write them, design them decades ago. And so we have the conventional system that does not look at digital centralized motor systems. So distributors now have to make this possible, to make this feasible, the integration or at least the connection of the energy resources that are distributed in the network. So this means today we have over 40 giga in distributed generation in Brazil. Years ago, someone who meant to have a distributed generation plant would find the land, the equipment, and that would be fine because the systems had the capacity. We didn't have flow inversion problems, reactive voltage level problems, but now it's a different case. In order to do something like that, we need to have the right planning to really plan things accurately and closely. So this was an error we had in Brazil in the past in regards to planning, because we did not plan the distributed generation accurately or as needed. And now when we look at the future, we have other distributed energy resources that are evolving that may bring problems that are similar to those we have today with distributed energy, technical aspects. In storage, for instance, how are we going to incentivize storage in Brazil? We need to plan these things right now, because these things will evolve. EVs, electrical vehicles, they're competitive price-wise compared to combustion to fuel vehicles. People think they can buy an EV, get to drive to their buildings and charge them whenever they want. This is possible now. Just as in 2015, we had distributed generation nationwide, but there will be a point when the buildings will not be able to support the load when all consumers get back home, when all EV owners get back home and wish to charge their vehicles at the same time. They will not have the capacity, and this is where the DSO comes into play, is going beyond the distributor, because we need to have the capacity. We need to inform the population as to where the capacity exists, which services can be provided, and of course, regulations play a key role here. Without the right price, I cannot tell consumers what's the best time to charge their vehicles, or we cannot actually foster one determined region. Raj talked about a neighborhood in the US that requires more capacity. How can we foster these things? Without the information, we need to consider things carefully. What are we actually talking about when we say we want DSO? We need to be very clear on the pathway going forward. It's as an analogy, it's as though, we wish to buy a mobile phone, cutting edge, the latest model with AI integration. If we're just going to use this phone to send messages and make calls, what is it that we are actually willing to take from this new distribution system? We need to have the regulatory framework in place first. Thank you, Lucas. Yes, it is quite a challenge. In fact, distributors were not cut out, right, to address the current needs. It is a fact. When we look at the regulatory system as well, we have to really work on the new regulatory framework. These are very interesting ideas that we're sharing, very interesting dialogue. I will now turn it over to Daniela from the ONS. Good morning, Daniela. I believe you will share your slides, right? Yes, correct. So feel free to begin. You're going to bring ONS's view on DSOs and the challenge in regards to the DSO DNO integration. Thank you, Leonardo. Good morning to all. Yes, I will share a very short presentation seeking to talk about the challenges that are being faced in the operation today, the project we have here at the ONS to address these challenges. So here's my screen. You can see it, but it's not in presentation mode. Full screen. Okay, there you go. So here we have some numbers. When it comes to the matrix, our mix, we're undergoing an important transformation in our electricity generation mix, which was basically hydropower. Hydro before, now we have more renewable intermittent resources. In less than 5 years' time, predominantly it will be hydro. The current installed capacity of MMGD surpasses 33 gigawatts, and according to forecast, by 2029, this will go up to 49 giga, meaning that this may become the second largest source of generation in Brazil. And with this in mind, with these changes in our mix, well, especially in renewables, resources that are not managed directly by ONS. This model, with all the control systems we have had so far, well, it is not sufficient anymore. We need to evolve to hybrid command, control, and orchestration. This is so important for ONS. It's part of our strategic planning. It's one of our strategic goals, a priority for us to handle this situation. Therefore, we have recently concluded the ONS integration, DSO integration program. We worked with PSR and Diamond Consulting Company. Daniel is here. He collaborated with us in this process. As an operator, a national operator, ONS needs to prepare for this new scenario. With this project, we are talking about designing aspects that are related to the integration, the interface between ONS and the distributors. We've also designed recommendations in relation to the regulations, the regulatory recommendations that we will also be handling. I should also mention this project looked very closely to this interface between ONS and the DSOs. As we've heard today, this is a very broad discussion that consists of interactions between different players, different stakeholders in the energy system. But in our case, we focused on this particular interface. So we came up with this conceptual design, looking at the assessment of international experiences. We came up with this model over here, number 3. And this consists of a mechanism that was proposed for Brazil. As part of our project, we have the following assumptions, focusing on systems needs from ONS, clear regulatory framework, and defined responsibilities. The implementation will be, feasible in the short term, but always aligned with long-term objectives, also looking at important guidelines such as, ONS does not need to maintain an operational relationship with REDs, with DERs. It will be actually the intermediary player, and there will be a gradual implementation. So we will learn as we implement this project to make the necessary adjustments as we go. As part of this project, we also designed the current scenario in Brazil in regards to the distribution companies, their roles, and acknowledging the need to take on this responsibility as managers of distributed energy resources as part of their networks. However, we know they will be facing challenges, and there are different needs and realities in different regions in Brazil. This also should be accounted for as part of the process. And some distribution companies have their own platforms to manage these resources, DERMS, ADNS. And in closing, I would just like to make a few remarks about the future of these operations in Brazil. As we've heard from our previous speakers, MMGDs are growing steadily, especially with solar energy. We have greater operational complexity due to the increasing integration of intermittent renewable sources. Climate change also plays a role. Need to use water resources, multiple water resources. We have new technologies and storage, which will enable greater integration of these renewable sources and will provide more flexibility. And we have massive incorporation, adoption of technology, also to handle the new challenges in these operations. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you. Back to you, Leonardo. Thank you, Daniela. Yes, it's quite a challenge, and we should bear in mind in this study that is carried out by the ONS together with PCR Diamond. This is a great study. We have really some insights, important insights on how we are going, well, we can evolve in regards to DSO and DRs. Now to Gabrielle from PCR, our last speaker in this round of presentations. Over to you, Gabrielle. Hello, Leonardo. Thank you for inviting me for the opportunity. Let me just point to the following. PCR was also involved in the study that was conducted by ONS, by the national regulator. We have this interface between the DSO, DNOs, and today we're focusing on DSO, the interface and distribution worlds, right? So we read your proposals, plans, and therefore I would ask you to please give us, some highlights about the challenge in relation to distribution. Besides the interface with the transmission, how can we enhance the operations, planning, and better use the distributed energy resources? Thank you. Thank you, Leonardo. Greetings to all of our panelists and participants. And yes, of course, Gabrielle, if I may, apologies, I forgot to mention that we are receiving some questions through the chat box. And we would like to address them to the panelists. So you may all answer via chat, please. We don't want any of them to go unanswered. Thank you, Gabrielle. Sure. So as you and Daniela have also mentioned, yes, we were involved in this important study focusing on, of course, we supported ONS to look at this important need, a requirement on how to, look at this interface between DSO and DNO. This was an extremely interesting process for different reasons. On our side, we also collaborated with international partners. Of course, Diamond created this study and shared the reports with ONS, and we also collaborated with the university in Spain. It was really instrumental with the operating side. Danielle also touched on that. And so we wrote an article together, a paper that we presented in an international congress last month, a paper that focused on the fundamentals, on the basic principles. So what are the key needs, so to speak, that we identified in Brazil? Also looking at international, what is happening, in foreign processes. So to me, this is a very timely discussion for Brazil and for other countries, and all that we've heard so far, yes, is also very much in line to the discussions we also had with OMS. We identified urgent needs and where we have to take action. It was a very enriching process, and it was an amazing opportunity to be part of this project for me at a personal level. It's a relevant project for Brazil and globally at a higher level because we, as I mentioned, we held discussions in international conferences and meetings. We engaged with other stakeholders, international stakeholders. It was a very interesting, enriching process. Having said that, well, how do we link all of this with the distribution company? Something we've been discussing for a long time now. Their model was not designed considering, well, the current needs we are facing now. This applies to Brazil and to other countries as well. Maybe other countries have already are more evolved in this sense, but still, it is something we need to work on here. We're struggling in this transition process still, and innovation will be very important. We are looking at the possible pathways, such as for one, we are considering of course, distributors to be able to look at NWAs. Is the current discussion for us here in Brazil, something we've been following closely. Another important opportunity we're also studying is providing agents with more flexibility, higher flexibility at different levels. More flexibility, well, for distributors themselves in their operations as DSOs. So DSOs will be key partners in this process. And it's something that came up in many different discussions that we held, and also agents need to have more flexibility. And we, of course, need to have major players delivering these valuable products to the system.
I would like to highlight the demand response program. It has moved forward. We try to bring in demand agents that are in the distribution network. They can indeed contribute to our reality. This is something we believe is interesting. We believe this could be even broadened, right? Response to demand. Other agents in the grid can also contribute to that. There is another category that is connected to providing autonomy to agents in the transmission area. This is another type of work we've been conducting and assessing in different ways. And it can be really valuable if we think from an ONS or national operator of the system perspective. If we think of different agents and institutions, this can be an interesting process. It's being developed together with CCE. It's more focused on transmission, but of course there's a connection to the topic at hand. So moving back to the distribution network, we see space for new agents, for distributors also becoming adults, so to speak, right? To conduct DSO activities. The way the Brazilian sector has been structured, it would be natural to allocate DSO activities to distributors. But of course, it takes planning, development, together with distributors and institutions. It's not a simple task, but it's doable. And then that is why we are proposing this direction. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriel. Yes, this vision by PCR bringing innovations to us, this is really interesting. And yeah, we do count on your partnership as well in order to approach this major challenge. So we've had the initial remarks from our participants. We have questions, and the panelists can answer in writing if you want, or if you want to answer the questions. But now I'm going to switch gears a bit. I'd like to tackle some of the questions that came here from the audience. There's an interesting question. When we look at the regulatory challenge, it's important to balance the expansion capacity of distributors, considering that this is the best alternative, but also looking at a regulation based on assets. We have a regulation, or RAB and WACC. So we have a challenge, which is trying to incentivize or actually use efficiently distributed energy resources that might compete or become more feasible. How do you see, how can you balance this incentive of the expansion of using NWA, RAB, WACC? This is something we've been debating at ANEEL. We see a compensation model. As the report shows, we can separate compensation to the market. There are some models that can be used when we look at TOTEX models. I don't know, would anyone like to make a comment about this question? Hello, Luke. Hello. Yeah, I can comment. I believe we have to think about that from a regulatory perspective. That's why I said that our system was not prepared for the DSO future. We still have some regulatory ties. We're not prepared for this system in which the distributor would be doing that task. When we talk about NWAs, it's not about not investing. Quite the opposite. If we want to have platforms, services, wireless services, ancillary services, services that can be dispatched, that means lots of sensors in the grid, investment in technology, platform cybersecurity. The problem is that the current regulatory model to compensate for these assets does not allow to identify investments that will be necessary for us to evolve into a DSO system. Because we need the regulatory and legal safety in order to perform these investments. So we have to bring these assets into our system. We need to evolve economic regulations. The accounting systems have to evolve. We can think of the useful life of a transformer or a sensor or a communication system or a hardware and software system that controls the grid. Technologies evolve at a faster pace than regulation. So there's a regulation to calculate depreciation. It has to be adequate to electric assets as we know them. It also has to look at new assets that maybe will have a shelf life of 5 or 8 years, and they will become obsolete faster. ANEEL should eliminate barriers and foster the type of investments we do need to reach the new distribution standard when we look at between different agents in the electric system. Thank you, Lucas. Would anyone else like to comment?
This is Raj. That's a good question. And as a former regulator, this is a challenge for the regulators how to deal with this. Mr. Lucas is right that the distribution system needs a lot of upgrades to facilitate distributed energy resources. So there'll be new investments that the distribution utility has to make to accommodate the DERs. So that's one side of the equation, but some of the DERs would also help reduce the need for certain investments. So on the one side, there is incremental investment to accommodate DERs to facilitate, and some of the NWS would also help lead to reduced need for investments. I think this question on if there is a reduced investment and the utility typically would have earned a return, the weighted average cost of capital on the regulated asset base, RAB, why would the utilities want to invest or participate in NWS that could reduce the RAB and the associated depreciation and return? So the regulators have a challenge there to incentivize the distribution company, to take the right action that's in the interest of the consumers. Overall, as Mr. Lucas said, keeping the lights on is number one, is the challenge, the necessary goal. But also keeping rates as low as possible, prices is another interest of everybody. And so regulators can try different things of how to incentivize. One, to the extent the NWS lead to overall cost reductions, and you have to figure out how to compute those cost reductions, net savings over a lifetime, and provide perhaps to the utility some share of the savings kind of approach. Okay, if you're saving consumers X as a result of these actions, the utility should be entitled to some share of it for facilitating, motivating this action. That's one approach. The second approach could be that instead of passing through some of these distributed energy resources, again, it's not cost-free, it's just a lower cost. And in some accounting systems, cost may be expensed. So which means there's no return on it. The utility gets one-to-one the recovery of those O&M costs. Instead of considering it as an O&M cost, should some of it be considered as a capital cost in which the utility earns a return? So although the overall cost to the consumer may go down, by using this approach, the utility may still get some money back if it's considered as a capital. The third is if the regulators consider some of these goals, whether it's electric vehicle penetration or rooftop solar penetration or storage whatever goals, metrics you want to use, if the utilities achieve those goals and go beyond, there could be a rate of return incentives associated with it. So there are different ways regulators can think about how do we incentivize the distribution utilities to be motivated to perform these tasks or engage in these activities that are in the interest of the consumers and also are interest of the shareholders of the utilities. So that's a balancing act. Again, there's no one magic solution. It's some trial and error, looking at different approaches, what works. And clearly working with the stakeholders is extremely important in developing solutions. That's my thoughts, Leonardo. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Thank you very much for your contribution about this topic and for sharing your expertise with us. If no one else wants to comment on this specific question, there's another interesting point I think the panel should comment on. A couple of people asked about this. We talk a lot about RED or DERs, but currently distributed energy resources are the most present and challenging one when it comes to optimizing the grid is MMGD, which is the Brazilian acronym for micro and mini distributed generation, MMGG. So there's a question about the amount of installed MMGD in our country. This is a hit in Brazil. It's very successful, the integration of these resources into our mix. It will keep on growing for a while, micro and mini distributed generation. And the ONS, the national operator of the system, doesn't have access to this information, doesn't have control, or they cannot observe, and this is necessary for the ONS. What is your view as panelists about the role of DSO in the active management of these MMG resources? Of course, Daniela mentioned that. She gave us an overview in her presentation by ONS. We face the challenge of not only optimizing the distribution system by using distributed energy resources, but we have to have a holistic perspective, looking at the Brazilian bulk power system as a whole. Would anyone like to comment? Hello, Leonardo. I think it's really the role actually of DSOs in this management process is very important. Yes, ONS does not have the visibility of these resources, and they have an impact in the system operation. Sometimes it's difficult to control voltage, frequency, sometimes there's overload. How can ONS control all these problems? I think the best way forward is to have a DSO playing the role of intermediary through mechanisms that ONS would use to activate the DSOs. There's this growing scenario of decentralized generation in our country. So it's really important to look at the role of DSOs. They have an important role to play. If I may add, I agree with what Daniela just said. This is connected to my previous point. We want to provide autonomy to agents. There is an interface between what is in distribution and transmission. It can be the ONS or the agents as well. This interaction is very valuable. That's what most countries are doing. We looked at the TSO, DSO international scenario. That was the transition we observed. Countries that had an initial stage like Brazil, huge disorganized growth of distributed generation without actually planning on the consequences for the system. These countries have revised or are about to revise this to at least put the new agents in the new regulatory framework. This is one of the elements we clearly saw. We don't want to touch the old system. We want everyone to be in the same side, including distributors. Of course, we know about all the challenges for distributors and transmitters. If incentives are aligned, if we have clear signs, and if everything is compatible, yes, it is possible to have the support of different agents. Regarding compensation, for instance, which is a big challenge. Something in DSO activities are new. Some things are new. They have to be compensated accordingly. And some are essentially part of the distributor's work. In our work, we tried to strike a balance and a dialogue between ONS and ANEEL expectations from the DSO and what distributors themselves believe is possible considering their infrastructure. Thank you, Gabriel. Would anyone like to comment? If I may, when we look at the Q&A questions, we see concern in many of these questions about distributors doing this operation in real time and acting regarding some problems we face today. Just piggybacking on what Daniela and Gabriel said, we believe this is a staged approach and we cannot skip stages, because if we do that, we might cause even further disturbance. We have to separate distribution and commercialization activities. We need modern prices and tariffs that take into account different times of the day, different parties, different locations. We need a centralizing agent that can provide clearly information about what needs to be generated at what time. If we don't have this, it's impossible to move forward. So we have a stage that is key, which is defining governance. Many roles for the DSO that have been imagined and that might lead to some concerns. There's no possibility of having cuts by distributors. But anyway, this is still being built. And if it's still being built, it's important to reflect on the role that these agents will have, specifically these players. And after we understand these roles, we have a clear governance. Then we have to align on the regulatory frameworks and on the tech advancements. Currently, distributors cannot cut on a generator in their area. They don't have the autonomy to do that. So we need to establish what is the algorithm. We have this for centralized companies so that they can choose which generators are cut or what is distributed, what can be dispatched. After we define governance, regulatory frameworks, then we have to look at tech advancements. If we think of mini generation, these are a little bit larger. Very few can be controlled by a distributor, by the ONS, or by anyone but the actual owner of the distributed resource. And in the micro, we have no control whatsoever. And after we solve governance, then we can move to the operation of these plants. We need tech changes that will allow us to do this in an automated, remote manner. I believe when we think of the different stages that Luiz presented, we are still far removed from that point. Agents have to be clearly aligned. We need compensation models that are clearly set. Before having that, we don't even know there will be interest from distributors to go there. So we cannot skip any steps, and then we will finally reach what we wish for DSO as real-time operators.
If I may just add a couple of comments, I agree with most of what is being said, and this emphasizes the need for enhanced planning, both at the distributed level and the bulk power level, the impact of various DERs on the system, and also the planning would reveal what's the best place to have the DERs. As somebody mentioned, instead of a haphazard expansion with no rules, no guidelines, a better planning system, and with the caveats that Mr. Lucas identified, would be an enhancement from status quo. The second is, I completely agree on the compensation. What are the incentives that are there? How do we pay for the DERs? what is the value that they add to the system, to the reliability of the system, or other parameters. So the compensation should be tied to the value they provide, and as opposed to other mechanisms that may overpay them or underpay them. And the same thing, what tariffs do consumers face, those that implement DERs? Are they still paying their fair share to the distribution utility as they continue to rely on the grid, even though they may have DERs? So the planning exercise and the tariffs and the payments to the DERs, all these are relevant, important aspects as we navigate this expansion of DERs in the future. So.
Thank you, Raj, for your remarks once again. Well, we are now reaching the end of our webinar, but maybe we can take one or two questions before we adjourn. And during the presentation and in our report, RAP actually sets forth a proposal on how we should tackle this topic and shares information about the sandboxes, shares experiences that can also be used in pilot plans. We have been looking at these initiatives closely to move faster. And in the meantime, of course, we're holding assessments and looking at the other experiences that are out there. We got a question on the possible topic for a sandbox. An interesting question because we are, of course, also open looking at sandbox. We do not have clear guidelines. However, we know there are important topics for discussion. Bianca mentioned the Administrative Act 111 from the Ministry of Mines and Energy about these adjustments, the tariff reviews. We have sandboxes looking at that. We have the integration with DSO. And one question, which topic, in your views, should be discussed as a priority through a sandbox mechanism? Would anyone wish to answer? I think, Leonardo, maybe we could talk about the next step we're considering. The ONS. One of the activities we have been working on is a regulatory sandbox looking at the intermediated drought mechanism. We're going to look at the propositions that were produced in the project, and we will be looking at this topic. We'll have an in-depth analysis in this regard. The DRs, the distribution companies, ONS, we will all be sitting at the table to hold these discussions together with ANEEL about the facilitation process. We're going to produce a document in 2025 this year. Everyone is invited to collaborate and draft this document jointly. It will be also very timely. We are planning to start out with short-term plans. We need to take one step at a time, as we've heard here. And so we will start out with these short-term plans. And we will also be open to talk about the regulatory framework that we will be developing. So I just wanted to point this out. It's very interesting. And I would add that, yes, we're also very happy. This is one of our recommendations to move forward with the sandbox. Together with ONS, we looked at what the next steps can be. We talked about, well, what this regulatory framework should consist of, looking at infrastructure, the mechanisms, but what is mandatory in regards to the sandbox? We need to first identify where we should start out in terms of the distribution companies who will be ready to participate as DSOs, and then also the DERs. They already have, whenever they have the infrastructure that will allow them to do so, to part of this process, we need to be clear on how the mechanism will be used, the incentives, the protocols, and how things will evolve. In our project, we also separated these things. It's one thing to create a sandbox. You need to have a clear incentive for the agents to engage, because of course it's easier to maintain things as they are than to change things. Whereas if you already have a clear idea of where you're going, and it will be easier to engage these stakeholders, both DSOs and DERs. From then, once we have these in place, we can, of course, test how things will work and the communication between the DSOs, the DERs, and going forward, this, of course, will play a very important role. That is a given to having distributors engaged in this process. But yes, this pilot with the sandbox will be very important. So that will be an important next step. Thank you, Gabrielle. Well, we are pressed for time. So in the interest of time, we will now have the closing remarks from all of our panelists. There are questions that we will try to answer later on. We will find out how. So I would like to turn it over to Bianca for her closing remarks. First, please. Thank you, Leonardo. It's been great to join this panel discussion. Very rich and interesting discussions, different viewpoints. As Lucas mentioned, yes, we need to have a clear governance system and rules going forward. This transition is not just a technical or regulatory transition for DSOs. It's also structural, and the ministry is also following this process very closely, and we are also engaged with this important action. And also, as Daniela said, integration is very important. The ONS with DSOs and ANEEL and the pilot with the sandbox pilot will give us a clear view on how we will move forward, what the next steps will be. ANEEL is also looking very closely at all of that is happening. We will also need to hold discussions about the role DSOs will have as planners. They will also be involved with planning, what system is in place today, what we will have in the future. We need to also hold more discussions, find the synergy, and short-term plans. Thank you once again. It's quite a challenging initiative, but we're very glad to be involved in this process. Thank you, Bianca. Lucas, over to you. Thank you, Leonardo, for moderating this panel. Thank you to all of the panelists for their inputs, their remarks. Raj also joining us, Alejandro, and these are very rich discussion. Almost 1 decade ago, I read an article from the MIT, and then in 2019, Professor Tomolskin also released a book about first generation and second generation traditional systems and things. Well, we're not very concrete back then, but today this is, already happening in many countries. Distribution companies operating as DSOs. And this is a beacon of light for us in Brazil. And it's actually indicating what we want to do, which roles we want to attribute to this stakeholder, the new business models and opportunities that will arise in the energy system, and at the end of the day, for the Brazilian economy and for consumers too, as protagonists. And we should also bear in mind this transition is about the consumer. If consumers are not aware of how this is happening, if they do not trust these new stakeholders and DSOs, things will not evolve as expected. We need to have clear rules, clearly defined roles, and consumers need to buy this idea. And of course, request these new services that will, of course, that have to do with this integration, with the grid, with the network. So if we want for this plan to take off, we need to build awareness, to engage different stakeholders in this discussion, and Abrade, in this regard, has played a strategic role. We will conduct a study on how we're going to deploy this new system and what our role can be to facilitate this process. We will definitely have new rounds of discussions and panel discussions, with interactions with the regulator, other stakeholders in our industry, to move from the theory to action and to have this new role for distribution companies in Brazil. Thank you, Lucas. Daniela, over to you. I would also like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to join this meeting, looking at all that has been achieved so far and all that we're planning to do going forward through this collaboration, building a robust operation model. And hopefully we will meet many other times to continue evolving and sharing, of course, the new plans that we're working on. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Daniela. Gabrielle? Thank you, Leonardo, and to everybody. Well, yes, it is extremely fulfilling to be here and see that our discussions are bearing fruit in Brazil in particular, and there are many opportunities that lie ahead for Brazil and for all countries. Innovation, breakthroughs are extremely important. We want to orchestrate this new regulatory framework to drive technology breakthroughs. We are highly interested and engaged with this process, and we're very happy with the interest around this topic. Thank you. Thank you, Gabrielle. So I would finally like to say that, yes, it was a valuable opportunity to be here in this panel. We have talked about the challenges, concerns, opportunities, and approaches. We have had the opportunity to answer some of the questions that we received. The others will be answered going forward. This is one more step in this process. And there were questions on concerns in relation to neutrality, conflicts of interest, the roles different institutions will play and take on in this new structure. Of course, these answers will be addressed during the following discussions we'll be having. We will be focusing on transparency and openness all along. And we would urge you, well, all the stakeholders that are involved in the process to also bear this in mind as part of the process. How are we going to drive transparency, to have information shared with civil society, with the users on the operations of the system and the new structures that we will be deploying in Brazil? Thank you, Luiz. Back to you now. Thank you, Leonardo, and to all of our panelists. This has been an extremely interesting discussion. We have 29 questions in our chat box. So everyone is very interested and engaged in this dialogue, and we will surely be answering all of the questions and sharing also the video recording. We'll also share them on our social media platforms. I would like to ask our panelists, Raj, Alejandro, to turn on their camera, open their cameras, please, for the official photo. That would be great. Thank you. I don't know if you're all on already. Christina, can you please take a screenshot? So big smile, everyone. Okay, I think we're good. Thank you once again. And Alejandro will now make the closing remarks. Thanks, Alejandro. Over to you now.
Thanks a lot, Luis. And thanks all of you for being part of today's discussion, which, as we said, it has been very rich. I'm very happy to see all the questions that are in the chat. It has been also very encouraging to hear all the thoughtful reflections and all the concrete ideas on how we can move forward with this transition to distribution system operators. It's very clear that there is no single recipe, right? Brazil has to find its own path. And it certainly is going to be a progressive process. We hope again that the report that we have launched today that's going to be useful for the discussion, and we look forward to keep on working on it. It's very important. Like we have heard from ONS how distributed energy resources are no longer at the margin, right? They are not only peripheral. No, they are becoming a central part of the Brazilian power sector. And this is the reason why it's so important to rethink how we plan, how we operate the distribution system in all over the country. The conversation does not end here. We hope that this is just the beginning of a deeper cooperation, of a continued technical dialogue, and our job is to keep on sharing lessons across countries and institutions. And finally, I would like to thank all of you personally, but also the institutions that you represent, of course, the Ministry of Mines and Energy, ANEEL, ONS, Addepalli, and PSR. I said at the beginning that one of the challenges is of course inertia, and all the power systems in the world at some point they face this continuous process of updating the market's rules and the market design, all the market and legal framework. But I mean, when I see today's discussion, I see all the ingredients to have a successful reforms. I see a ministry that is engaging and is guiding in a strategic manner the discussion, a very capable regulator, of course, top quality system operator, a very engaged association of the distribution utilities, and very high level consultancy, which is just showing how high the technical discussion is in Brazil. So I think there are all the elements to be there, and I'm very optimistic about this process. Without further ado, I wish you a very nice day and see you soon.